Dr. Gerald Horne is the John J. and Rebecca Moore Chair of History and American Studies at the University of Houston. His research addresses issues of race, internationalism, politics, civil rights, and the global connections between developments in Asia, Africa, United States, and Europe. He is the author of more than 35 books at last count and over 100 scholarly articles. His most recent texts include I Dare Say, Gerald Horne Reader, which came out in 2024. That's on OR Books. He has another book which is coming out, which we'll talk about briefly, which is Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. He also produces regular commentary on KPFA, and he joins us today to talk a bit about his new text, but more to highlight recent developments in the country of South Africa. Dr. Horne, thanks for making time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Good. How have you been?
Well, a little under the weather, but I'll survive.
You'll survive. That's important for all of us. Give us a sketch of I Dare Say. Is it a collection of essays, Gerald? How is it?
It is a collection of essays ranging over recent decades up until a few years ago. The highlights, I would say, include an analysis of the lumpen, which has been a key concept for the now defunct Black Panther Party.
Right.
There is an analysis of what I call left-wing white nationalism. In other words, it puts in context the struggles now unfolding in what we now recognize as settler colonial regimes, be they Israel in historic Palestine, be it South Africa, or be it North America. Sadly, our friends and comrades in North America have not theorized sufficiently the concept of settler colonialism right here on these shores. And also, I think it's important to point out that in this collection of essays, that I critique the concept of so-called identity politics, not least because it has been used to defame various sectors of the Black liberation movement, but it has rarely been applied to Israel, a nation based upon an exclusivist political identity. And I dare say that one of the problems we have nowadays is this under-theorizing, which has made it difficult and problematic for many of our young friends and comrades who are now putting their bodies on the line to do so with the kind of energy and efficiency that we so desperately need.
Mm-hmm. One question that you raised there right away, you seem to be saying in some senses that there's been a neglect, a running away from this notion of settler colonialism. Why? And you mentioned Israel, you mentioned South Africa, you mentioned North America. As a historian, why is there the avoidance of or the running away from? Your thoughts?
Well, it's complicated. I would think that part of the problem here in North America is an overdetermination of the alleged progressivism of 1776, despite the fact that it led to massive dispossession of the indigenous, not to mention geometric and exponential expansion of enslavement of Africans. But supposedly, because 1776 was a great leap forward for humanity, even those who were dispossessed and enslaved are taught that they should celebrate their misery. And obviously that's unsustainable.
Okay. Your other text, which I'm just taking a look at, and I haven't given a read of it, but I did read the title of it. And I think we talked a year or so ago, or 9 months or so ago, when you were doing some of the work and research on it. Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. You got a lot of pieces in that title. Unpack some of those pieces for us, Gerald.
Well, first of all, I draw critical distinctions between and amongst armed propaganda. An example of that was what happened in Sacramento in May 1967, when the newly minted Black Panther Party entered the state legislature with arms in objection to various measures which would lead to a certain kind of gun control that they object to. And then there's armed self-defense, which you saw examples of that, which were legion. not least in December 1969 in Los Angeles, when the Panther chapter held off the LAPD, which assaulted the chapter and, in fact, was in the process of bringing tanks and other military materiel from military bases south of LA with regard to Oceanside. And then there's armed struggle. You saw an example of that in August 1970 when the teenager from Pasadena, Jonathan Jackson, assaulted with his comrades, including the late Ruchell Magee, the judge and the jury in a particular nettlesome case. It's unclear what their motivation was. There were those who said that they just wanted to get to a radio station and broadcast the horrible conditions that were afflicting the imprisoned. Others said that they intended to hijack a plane at SFO, San Francisco Airport, and somehow free political prisoners, not least George Jackson, Jonathan Jackson's brother. But in any case, Jonathan Jackson and a number of his comrades, and including the judge, wound up being killed. Now, this concept of armed self-defense, armed propaganda, armed struggle is placed in a broad political and historic context. I mean, for example, I point out that the Panthers were not the first group who sought to display this kind of approach. Going back to slavery and Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, for example, John Brown, 1859, not to mention the fact that a number of communists were trained by the Communist International in Moscow in 1930s in various kinds of armed struggle, not to mention the fact that certain militants blew up the LA Times building circa 1910, 1911, and another example of armed struggle. So this is the context in which I tell this story about Panthers and communists, black nationalists and liberals. Of course, in terms of black nationalists, you know that the concept of Kwanzaa was born in the Southland in Southern California by certain black nationalists. And of course, the liberals were exemplified by the NAACP, who raised quite a bit of money because they had a direct pipeline to celebrity culture in Hollywood. So in summary, that is the story of this book, which you can now find at better bookstores everywhere.
Mm-hmm. It's on international publishers. A question as we move away from this towards our discussion about South Africa. And you wrote a book, and it actually is one of your favorite pieces of mine, which was a Fire This Time, the Watts Uprising in the 1960s. What's that connection there? And people may remember the name of John Huggins and Bunchy Carter and Walter Pope, a number of others. But that connection between Southern California and between the Black Panther Party. I mean, Kathleen Cleaver and other people said that there were more attacks on Panthers in Southern California than any place else. How do those pieces fit together? Southern California, the Black Panther Party, police assault, SWAT. Where's the juncture there, Gerald?
Well, indeed, John Huggins was amongst the Panthers who were slain in early 1969 on the UCLA campus. The ostensible reason was a conflict over who would control a Black Studies department. One of the points that I tried to raise in this book is that a number of historians, when they deal with conflicts between the Panthers and certain Black nationalists, they tend to downplay the actual conflicts. And they also tend to downplay the fact that many of the Panthers were deeply influenced by the Socialist Project. I mean, if you look at Jonathan Jackson, the aforementioned teenager, he published a newsletter in his high school in Pasadena called Iskra, which was homage to, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution. Many of the Panthers were readers of Plekhanov, for example, a Marxist in Russia who was saluted by V.I. Lenin himself. But for various reasons, the historians, when they tackle these questions, they tend to throw a blanket over the nationalists and the socialist-oriented Panthers as if there were not significant differences between and amongst them. They're all incorporated in this rubric of, quote, black power, unquote. And I think that ultimately that's sort of misleading. And that's one of the issues I try to correct in this text.
Mm-hmm. You have, as we're moving towards Southern Africa, we spoke years ago when you had the book From the Barrel of a Gun, United States and the War Against Zimbabwe. And I know since then you've had another text which focused on Southern Africa, is that Confronting White Supremacy. So and when was that text? When was the white supremacy text was published recently? When was the Zimbabwe text published, Gerald?
About 24, 25 years ago. Although there is connection between all of these books that we're mentioning, because it's no secret that the Panthers were deeply influenced by the example of armed struggle in Southern Africa. One of the differences, of course, is that they did not necessarily do the kind of comprehensive analysis of the forces on the ground that would have justified that particular strategy. And I think also that they were somewhat misled by this idea, aforementioned, that 1776 was this great leap forward for humanity. That was an armed struggle led by slave owners primarily against British colonists. And rather simplistically, they thought that they could walk in the footsteps of those who perpetrated 1776. But that turned out to be misguided because, once again, I don't think that there was an adequate analysis of settler colonialism. We also know that settler colonialism involves class collaboration, be it in historic Palestine, be it in South Africa, be it in Zimbabwe. You saw that in the South African elections, where the neo-apartheid party, the Democratic Alliance, got 20 to 22% of the vote, almost all from descendants of the original European settlers. And as I say in the book, we should not see it as happenstance or accidental that Mr. Trump received 75 million votes in a country of 330 million. It would be mathematically imprecise to suggest that those votes all came from the 1%. And so until we grasp the nettle of settler colonialism and class collaboration, it will inevitably lead to the kinds of debacles that the Black Panthers encountered when they launched armed struggle in the 1960s and 1970s. And as well, it bids fair to lead us into the dark night of fascism if we're not careful.
Mm-hmm. Why did the Pan-African movements, the Black liberation movements of the 50s and the 60s, post-Manchester, why did they elevate and people in the global human rights movement, why did the case of Nelson Mandela, the case of anti-apartheid, get placed on the top shelf of those organizations, not just Pan-Africanists, but globally? Why does that become so important?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, the African National Congress was in a strategic alliance with the South African Communist Party. One of the points I make in the book in hand, dealing with Panthers and communists, is that despite the fact that the so-called Communist International, the umbrella organization of communist parties, was virtually dissolved in the 1940s, it left a legacy of coordination between and amongst communist parties worldwide. And the Communist Party of South Africa had influence in the then socialist camp, had an influence in North America. I recall when I was much younger, meeting in New York, Moses Mabhida, who was the leader of the South African Communist Party, meeting him in Harlem. And so because of those kinds of connections, that led directly to the elevation of Mandela, who, by the way, for a good deal of his adult life, was probably part of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When South Africa, when Mandela was released in 1994 after the events of the 1980s, the UDF and the other mass democratic movement, give us a sketch of the choices and the external factors that drove the way the ANC and the alliance decided to take those first steps of a new government. People talk about GEAR and the RDP, but there may have been some other factors. I want you to dig into that for us.
Other factors indeed. Recall that the Berlin Wall collapsed in November 1989. Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners were fundamentally unbanned or freed a few months later in February 1990. As I say in my book, F.W. de Klerk, the last apartheid leader, recognized sagely that with the impending collapse of the socialist camp, starting in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, which had been a stalwart supporter of the ANC and the South African Communist Party, that the forces that he was negotiating with would be handicapped. And so I always find it curious that when folks talk about Mandela today, oftentimes disparagingly, they don't talk about this global context. You see the same thing in the Palestinian struggle. That is to say, when the socialist camp collapsed in 1989, 1990, this obviously handicapped the Palestinian Liberation Organization. It led directly to Oslo, but many of our more sagacious analysts oftentimes ignore that context, and it leads them to subjective analyses. That is to say that Yasser Arafat sold out, Mandela sold out, the ANC sold out, without looking at this global context. And that global context is still relevant today in 2024.
This gear strategy, which there's a debate. I haven't delved into it enough to give credence to the discussion about it. But the thought was that South Africa, the ANC had to make a decision or made a decision between the gear strategy, the growth, employment, and redistribution strategy, and the RDP, Reconstruction and Development Project. What did that mean in terms of how the leadership, not simply Mandela, but coming after that to Mbeki and then later Zuma, and as we see now Ramaphosa, what impact has that had on the challenges that South Africa faced and now faces?
Well, it had significant impact on the challenges that South Africa has faced. In fact, RDP was derided by its critics as rumors, dreams, promises. And of course, the fact that there was disappointment with regard to the trajectory of redistribution in South Africa, that led, in my estimation, to one of the fatal blunders of the leadership of the ANC and the South African Communist Party. That is to say, recalling the second president, Thabo Mbeki, and replacing him with Jacob Zuma, who ruled from approximately 2008 to 2018. His rule, or misrule, I should say, was rather disastrous. If you look at the numbers, you begin to see the South African economy heading south when Mr. Zuma and his sticky fingers and that of his comrades came into power, which makes it even more ironic and curious that in this recent election that took place this past week, a major victor was the so-called MK party of one Jacob Zuma, which got about 15% of the vote, and most of which was from KwaZulu-Natal. And what's interesting about that is that even though the alliance, the ANC, the South African Communist Party, COSATU, they have assiduously pursued a so-called non-tribal, even non-racial approach, Mr. Zuma put his Zulu card front and center and got significant votes from KwaZulu-Natal. And what's interesting about that is that when he came under fire because of all these different legal cases, in 2021, right, there was a January 6th style insurrection in Durban with almost 400 people killed, perhaps likely at the behest of one Jacob Zuma. So I think that Mr. Zuma has a lot of explaining to do, but I think also that the leadership has a lot of explaining to do in terms of why they chose to replace Thabo with Zuma.
Now, all of these, including Malema and his deputy assistant, as well as Zuma, all of these are ANC. So I have a few thoughts in my brain. I mean, looking at this in terms of internally what was going on in the ANC. I think when I saw you last week on a program, you were talking about that particular notion. But those transitions between Mbeki to Zuma, and then from Mbeki to Zuma, and then from Zuma to Ramaphosa, they both were kind of they reflected a lot of what was going on in the ANC, meaning no confidence vote and no confidence vote, and then Zuma leaves office. He'd set up some things before he left, but he leaves office. Your thought on what happened in those two transitions there, Gerald?
Well, I always found it curious that Thabo Mbeki was dislodged because in 2008 it was said he wasn't operating in a collective fashion. Anyone who knows themes about the political struggle in South Africa know that they really privileged the idea of collectivity. And so it seemed to me that he was a kind of fall guy. And interestingly enough, if you go back and look at the press, and once again, let's return to the external environment, you'll see hints from the U.S. corporate media that if Thabo Mbeki were replaced by Jacob Zuma, then the incoming leadership would take a harsher line towards Zimbabwe, the neighbor to the north, which had embarked on a process of land reform, seizing land from settlers and redistributing it to various cadre and others. And this led to trying to drive Zimbabwe into the ditch, which was not altogether successful. That was a not so subtle message to South Africa with regard to redistribution, not to mention a not so subtle message to Namibia, the country to the north, which also faces a question of redistribution. And also on this question of the external environment, it's no secret that Washington is upset with South Africa under Ramaphosa because of their bringing this case before the International Court of Justice against U.S. ally Israel, making out a plausible case for genocide, which has paved the way for another case in the International Criminal Court seeking a warrant for the arrest of Mr. Netanyahu and his chief military advisor, Mr. Gallant. Not to mention the fact that South Africa is a member of good standing of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which Washington sees correctly as a challenger to the Group of Seven, that is to say the United States, Canada, the Western European nations, plus Japan. And so these sorts of external factors cannot be ignored. And then, of course, you should keep in mind what happened in late 2023 when the U.S. ambassador charged that the Ramaphosa regime was actually supplying military materiel to the Russians, in Ukraine, of course. Now, it's no secret that Washington wanted a more muscular approach by Pretoria to the special military operation, but in light of the South African alliance with Russia and BRICS, that was not forthcoming. And so all of these factors help to factor into why, for example, the neo-apartheid party, the Democratic Alliance, which was backed subtly, if not subtly, by Washington, did 20 to 22%. Interestingly enough, if you listen to the Voice of America, the U.S. propaganda arm, Africa News Tonight, their correspondent in Johannesburg, Darren Taylor, is also the correspondent for the Epoch Times, this hysterically anti-communist rag published in the United States that's maniacally anti-Chinese Communist Party. And I've oftentimes wondered why the Biden regime has kept him on as their correspondent in Johannesburg, given his politics.
Why Zuma? Going back to that particular notion, you mentioned, I think he went to jail for a couple of months in 2021 when rebellion broke out in many different parts of Gauteng and also the KwaZulu area. When he came into office, he had a track record. He was accused. I think he was acquitted of the notion of rape. Clearly, the commission he had set up, the Zondo Commission, talked about all the improprieties, the Gupta family, etc. He's superseded the Inkatha Freedom Party. Why? Why Zuma? What does Zuma represent? Why is he still, quote unquote, a player in the process?
Well, I think in part it speaks to Zulu ethnocentrism. Mr. Zuma, as he has made clear, considers himself a proud son of KwaZulu Natal, a proud son of Durban, for example. It's also interesting that in addition to running on a platform during these recent elections that called for expropriation of the commanding heights of the economy, he tossed in certain kinds of social conservatism by suggesting that pregnant teenage girls be exiled to Robben Island, where he had served a term during the battle days of apartheid. This was a real head scratcher, I must say, but it reflects the rather eclectic approach of Mr. Zuma and his MK party. I recall that MK is the acronym for the Spirit of the Nation, the arm wing of the ANC, which has been given substantial credit, that is to say, the Spirit of the Nation, for helping to bring the apartheid enemy to the negotiating table. By stealing that name, Mr. Zuma and his party were able to steal the thunder delivered by the MK and took advantage of that as well. And I'm happy to see that you mentioned some of the scandals that he was involved in, not least the Gupta brothers, also from KwaZulu Natal, who are in exile in the United Arab Emirates, which is refusing to extradite them back home in South Africa to stand trial. You mentioned the Zondo Commission and this notion of state capture. That is to say, the sticky fingers of Mr. Zuma and his comrades and his dozens, perhaps, of children who use the state coffers as a kind of cookie jar. And it does not speak well for KwaZulu Natal or for the votes he got in Gauteng that Mr. Zuma did so well.
Mm-hmm. What if is a bad way to start a question there, but this notion that this is what you see when you talked earlier about Zuma's party and other parties is 58 plus parties that ran for election, this kind of nationalistic, xenophobic factor. How much of this is it easy to say that this is the result of the way that the ANC and the alliance misgoverned? That's why South Africa finds itself at this point with the economic freedom fighters, with the Democratic Alliance, etc. Where do we just say that, yeah, the problems of nation building, but this has to sit on the lap of the ANC?
Well, sure. I mean, the ANC had 57% of the vote until recently, and obviously the buck stops with them. But as noted, there was a very complex and complicated external environment. There's also a fair amount of xenophobia in South Africa that has been stirred up by many of the descendants of the settlers in particular, because we know that given the sanctions and the suffering imposed upon Zimbabwe, there's been a substantial influx of Zimbabweans into South Africa because of the religious zealotry that's unfolding in neighboring Mozambique. You see a significant number of Mozambicans flooding into South Africa, not to mention Congolese, Somalis, Eritreans, Ethiopians. The list is long. And so this is a burden for the South African economy, which at the same time feels a debt of obligation to these African countries which stood in solidarity with the comrades during the battle days of apartheid, and yet they are oftentimes faced with these attempts to whip up xenophobia that they have not necessarily combated effectively.
Mm-hmm. What does this election mean? Going back to one of the earlier questions we had as to why movements around the world, African American, the African American churches particularly, were active around the anti-apartheid movement and free Nelson Mandela, a number of other things. So there was this somewhat of a dream that this piece of Africa, Southern Africa, the frontline states, it would be a bloc that would have a voice. So what did or what does this election mean to Africa, the recent election in South Africa?
Well, given the fact that the Democratic Alliance improved its numbers at the ballot box and it's a neo-apartheid party, it does not necessarily bode well for South African foreign policy. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with these negotiations as the ANC, which is at 40%, tries to get to 50% plus one. The corporate media in the United States is encouraging the ANC to cut a deal with the Democratic Alliance. Although if that were to happen, it would probably lead to further rifts and splits within the ranks of the ANC, which is probably part of the reason why they are encouraging such. Apparently, Mr. Zuma says that he will not cut a deal with the ANC unless they get rid of Cyril Ramaphosa, who replaced him. But the ANC leadership says that's a non-starter. That is to say, they don't feel it's appropriate to have some external force, which after all, when you got 14 to 15%, dictating what the majority party should do with regard to its leadership. The economic freedom fighters under Mr. Malema got 9 to 10%. Apparently, they don't see the continuation of Cyril Ramaphosa as a deal breaker, which might make them an appropriate coalition partner. But I think that there's a kind of suspicion in the ANC ranks of the EFF after all. When Thabo Mbeki was dislodged or recalled about 15 to 16 years ago, it was Julius Malema, a then leader of the ANC Youth League, who said that he would kill for Jacob Zuma and led the charge. And then, of course, there are charges of corruption with regard to Mr. Malema as well. But they probably could work something out with Mr. Malema, give him a low-ranking ministry like sports and recreation, for example. There are probably not that many opportunities for misdeeds with that particular ministry. But obviously, it's important for the ANC to keep control of the military, the intelligence in particular, and the foreign ministry.
Why did the EFF? I think the figure was maybe closer to 8. I don't know. Maybe it's changed for the EFF. I think it was 10 the year before. I think it's closer to, but it went down. Why did it go down? Because Malema considers himself to be Pan-Africanist in the spirit of Thomas Sankara. His issue is retaking land without compensation. Who did he appeal to, or who does he appeal to, and why did it decline? Is there a factor other than the Zuma factor?
Well, Mr. Malema himself pointed to the Zuma factor. He said that Mr. Zuma in the MK party stole his thunder, and there's probably something to that. I also think that it's clear that the economic freedom fighters has an appeal to the widespread disgruntlement amongst the working class and the poor in South Africa, who feel that 1994 and the anti-apartheid dispensation did not deliver adequately. They don't necessarily want to hear a complex analysis, which I just sketched in terms of the international environment and the example of Zimbabwe and what happened to Zimbabwe when it went down the road of redistribution of land. So Mr. Malema is a player with regard to these coalition negotiations, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if he wound up in the government, despite the reservations about him in his past in the highest ranks of the ANC.
Okay. This generation, I was speaking with a gentleman from South Africa as a country, and he was giving a definition of what's referred to as the born free. Some of it, one of them applies directly to people who were born after 1994. Another one applies perhaps to people who were in the mass democratic movements of the 1980s. But somewhere in between, talking about both unions and youth here, somewhere between the events of Maracana in 2012 when Ramaphosa was, I think, on the board of lawmen, and then the events of fees must fall, roads must fall, etc. There seemed to be a voice of expectation from young people and the born free. Your thoughts on what this youth voice means, not only in South Africa, but what the youth voice may mean around the continent, what you see in Nigeria and other parts of the continent?
Well, in terms of President Ramaphosa, who is quite wealthy, we should also mention the scandal, the so-called Fala scandal, where this large cache of cash was found in a sofa at his commodious estate. Apparently, he was able to explain it away, but there are those who have their doubts. But you don't necessarily have to look at the born-free generation in South Africa to arrive at certain conclusions. I noticed that the conservative black congressman, Byron Donalds, who's apparently on the short list of Mr. Trump's potential VP candidates, he spoke fondly and nostalgically about the era of Jim Crow and how supposedly black families were doing better under the era of Jim Crow than they are doing today. And that kind of attitude is not necessarily unique to Congressman Donalds. I see it in a number of my students, for example, who are not necessarily conservative, but are sour about the present dispensation. And likewise, in South Africa, you have widespread sourness about the present dispensation because of homelessness and unemployment and poverty, etc. And that is a witch's brew that leads to votes, I'm afraid to say, for the misrule, the impending misrule of one Jacob Zuma.
What was I thinking here? When you told me that quote from, you threw me off there when you were talking about that the gentleman was saying we were better off under Jim Crow than right now, Gerald. So that was a little bit of a gut punch there, but we'll work around that. The labor, COSATU was a major piece. It was a super federation of labor unions. This is what Ramaphosa worked with. But clearly, if one goes with the themes of state capture and neoliberal agenda and the Democratic Alliance and other parties are talking about privatization, a number of other things. What's the fate for labor? What's the voice of labor? How strong is or how weak is the tripartite alliance?
Well, it's no secret that there are some rifts within the alliance. And once again, I would point to an external development. That is to say, BHP, which is an Australian mining conglomerate, was seeking most recently to purchase Anglo American, which has roots in South Africa, and of course is very important for the green economy and very important in terms of the contestation between the United States and Australia on the one hand and the People's Republic of China on the other. Gwede Mantashe, who is a leading member of the South African Communist Party and the ANC Minister of Mines, turned thumbs down on that takeover. And I noticed that just before the election, BHP threw in the towel reluctantly, but it's clear that they were not necessarily pleased with Mr. Mantashe's maneuver. And certainly there were those in the commanding heights of the economy, particularly in the Democratic Alliance, who also were displeased with what Gwede Mantashe was able to execute. So there are a lot of strains on this alliance, but it's going to be a real challenge to see what kind of coalition that the ANC is able to knock together, given these strains, given the internal contradictions, given the external factors, not least the pressure from U.S. imperialism and its domestic allies, speaking of the Democratic Alliance.
Thought question here. How much of a factor, Dr. Horne, we're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne. He has a new book which is coming out, which is going to be, which is titled, it's available now, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists, and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. He's previously written on this topic through a number of different lenses, some of his work around the American Revolution, developments of Haiti, but he had two specific books, From the Barrel of a Gun, the United States and the War Against Zimbabwe, as well as a recent book, the most recent book, White Supremacy Confronted, is on international publishers, as was the issue of Armed Struggle is on international publishers. So all of that said, in the run-up to the election, the discussion was, is the ANC going to lose its percentage? And my thought is that that's a point of discussion, but the issues that have to be addressed with nation building in South Africa are much more layered than that. What's your thought? I mean, the ANC has been losing votes since 2000, and that was the last time. That was the height of their votes, was 2004, and since then it's gone downhill. As has the percentage of people who register to vote, in fact, vote. So something else is happening here, Gerald. Your thoughts?
Well, one article in the otherwise hostile corporate media that appeared in the New York Times that I think your audience should pay attention to is the fact that there was a fair amount of redistribution, albeit to a African middle class and African elites like Mr. Ramaphosa. And to the extent that your material setting helps to shape your political consciousness, it's fair to infer that with the enrichment of a certain Black elite, that they not necessarily would be supportive of the ANC, which at least rhetorically says that it has a bias towards the poor. In other words, you cannot ignore the class question within the context of the African population and the disgruntlement with the ANC. I mean, for example, just before the election, the ANC unveiled a new healthcare program. And according to many in the elite, it's going to mean more taxes for them. And they're not necessarily happy about that, be they European, be they African, or whatever. So those are the kinds of contradictions that the ANC is facing, which on the one hand, it embarked on this economic program of Black economic empowerment, which in some ways was a substitute for not expropriating the commanding heights of the economy for fear that that would lead to Zimbabwe-style sanctions. But BEE has received withering criticism from the Democratic Alliance, which wants to junk it.
Right.
And given the fact that they improved their vote total, they may be well on their way to accomplishing that goal.
And regionally, Dr. Horne, put South Africa, you talked a bit about it before with the BRICS, but South Africa was expelling the Israeli ambassador who attempted to attend the AU meeting. They've been active around issues of the General Assembly. Regionally, what many of us thought as the frontline states, this bloc from Tanzania and the Zambia, Namibia, Mozambique, etc., Congo, etc. Your thoughts on what this means regionally, or how the regional developments over the last 30 years have had an impact on South Africa?
Well, I suspect that U.S. imperialism is trying to gain leverage against Pretoria, not least because of the ICJ case against Israel, this relationship with the BRICS. And I noticed that just a few weeks ago, there was an important trip by Secretary of State Blinken to Angola. Recall that in the 1970s, U.S. imperialism tried to block the independence of Angola under the leadership of today's ruling party, the MPLA. It took the dispatching of Cuban troops to thwart the apartheid invasion. But now Angola has become one of the major recipients of U.S. foreign aid. And in terms of helping to build a railway, I noticed even that there was military talk between the Angolan military and the U.S. military, which I found very curious. I interpret that as seeking to gain leverage against South Africa. Likewise, you saw that in Zimbabwe, U.S. in the recent weeks lifted or eased sanctions against the country, tightened them against the leadership.
Right.
And I dare say that the former was driven by this attempt to gain leverage against South Africa, not to mention the fact that Zimbabwe is a major producer of lithium, which Elon Musk says is a license to print money. I noticed that President Mnangagwa just attended the South Korea Africa Summit in Seoul. Now he's on his way to St. Petersburg to meet with President Putin and the International Economic Forum. But that probably cuts in South Africa's favor in light of South Africa's like-minded alliance with Russia through the BRICS.
Mm-hmm. Is China a factor in terms of South Africa-U.S. relations? China is a large trading partner of South Africa, correct?
Absolutely, China's a factor. As a matter of fact, the joke in Southern Africa, and perhaps the continent as a whole, is that when Chinese envoys arrive in the region, they want to talk about trade and upgrading relations. When U.S. envoys arrive in the region, they want to talk about China. And obviously, we're in the middle of a new Cold War targeting the People's Republic of China, and to a degree, confronting Russia as well. Given the fact that I don't expect the foreign ministry in Pretoria to go along with this new Cold War, this does not necessarily bode well in terms of improved relations between Pretoria and Washington. But on the other hand, I don't think Pretoria has a choice. I mean, why should they go along with a new Cold War against China, their major trading partner?
Gotcha. So where do I'm asking you this because that's your work over decades here focuses a lot on the idea of how does it impact global struggles? How does it impact the work that African American Black communities, global Black communities, how they make decisions, how they decide to support? You raised some of it earlier when you were talking about this kind of unwillingness to, among the progressive forces here, Black, whoever it may be, to talk about settler colonialism. For Pan-Africanism, how do we look at this, Gerald?
Well, I've been recommending incessantly that Black American organizations need to be sending envoys on a regular basis to the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, not to mention the Southern Cone of Africa, not to mention close by the Organization of American States, headquartered in Washington, D.C., a metro ride away for many of our leaders. There's no excuse for not doing so. But thus far, that kind of appeal has fallen on deaf ears. And I think it has a lot to do with the rather naive assessment of the forces in North America, the inability to consider and contemplate once again the class collaboration that adheres in settler colonialism, which helps to explain the 75 million strong Trump base, which turned out in 2020 and may turn out again in 2024. And so until we are able to cast aside these illusions about the United States of America and this historical trajectory, which shouldn't be that difficult for Black people, given the torturous reign of enslavement followed by a horrific Jim Crow U.S. apartheid, culminating in police terror that is raising havoc and wreaking havoc on our community. It shouldn't be that difficult to recognize that we need some external support. And what better external support than from the African Union and Addis Ababa, the Pretoria Foreign Ministry, the Organization of American States, and of course, the country that's excluded from the OAS, speaking of socialist Cuba.
But there must be some reason, digging a little bit further into this, why it's comfortable, given all the things, Jim Crow, Reconstruction, lynching, etc., that this notion of the role of settler colonialism, or that when they've read the media globally around South Africa, that the fact that the Democratic Alliance, which comes out of the Progressive Party of the 1950s or so, that their line from the time that Mandela walked out has essentially been the same. Their economic program has been the same. There's something that we're not trying to do or not willing to do. You mentioned specifically African Americans. What's that, Gerald?
Well, I think of Nicole Hannah-Jones of Howard University and her 1619 project, which, by the way, has been a runaway bestseller, which has incorporated notions that many mainstream historians objected to, insofar as it pointed to enslavement of Africans as a motive force for 1776, which sheds light on why we've been treated so horribly since the late 18th century. But alas, there has been legislation against the 1619 project. There have been attempts to squash the 1619 project, despite the fact that it's a runaway bestseller. And Nicole Hannah-Jones has stood tall despite the kinds of threats that have been imposed against her. And so I suspect that there are those who do not necessarily want to follow her example because they don't want to be threatened. They don't want to be subjected to legislation, for example, and attacked by the right wing, which is par for the course.
Okay. A couple of things. And what are you working on now, Gerald?
My next book, after Armed Struggle with a question mark, will be Slavery's Capital of Human Bondage in Washington, D.C. In other words, it's a story of this contradiction of this so-called empire for liberty, being a major slave trading city, being a major enterprise involving enslavement of Africans. And so look for that book next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to give you a compliment here. I mean, certainly many discussions about settler colonialism, 1776, and that. You've done that for years. You've been speaking about that for years. But I recently read an article, I believe in the Washington Post, which was talking about this ship that was discovered in Brazil. And you were quoted in that. You remember that? You remember this? It was a ship that was burned by somebody who was trading, stealing slaves after it had been outlawed. Is that correct?
Oh, sure. The Washington Post reporter, Terrence McCoy, I think his name was, he contacted me because, I wrote this book, The Deepest South, United States, Brazil, and the African Slave Trade, where I posit that one of the reasons Brazil has one of the most sizable populations of African descent this side of Nigeria is because of the manic energy of U.S. slave traders. Not only U.S. slave traders, but when Texas was an independent country between the mid-1830s and 1845, you also saw that Texans from the Lone Star State were dragging Africans across the Atlantic from Angola and Mozambique. So the United States has a lot to apologize for and a lot of explaining to do.
Okay. Dr. Gerald Horne, John J. and Rebecca Moore, Chair of History and American Studies, University of Houston. Look for his most recent book, Armed Struggles, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and the 70s. Also take a look at his recent work, not recent, but done past work on Zimbabwe, and his more recent work, of course, White Supremacy Confronted, International Publishers, and any of his titles are always worthy of taking a read at. Gerald, we appreciate you finding time to make time to be on Africa today, and we appreciate you, and take good care of yourself, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you for inviting me.